All right, it's 10 o'clock in the evening on day 3 of Collision. Ask us anything. Hello, I am Douglas Saltis, Editor-in-Chief of BetaKit. With me, as always, is Rob Kennedy, co-host of this BetaKit podcast. And we both just took lifts back to our homes, our respective homes, to record this very special Collision Edition AMA. As you might tell from the sound of my voice, I am a little slap happy from 3 days now of social interaction, full stop, but with a large number of people as the North American tech ecosystem has come to Toronto. So we thought it would be good to allow some of you to ask us questions about our thoughts, our experiences, anything Collision related. And that is what we're going to do now. And then I am going to black out. Rob, I don't know if you're going to go out to some late night parties, but I am shutting her down.
I've returned from them, and my voice is clearly 7 octaves lower from having gone out
easily.
For days.
Full baritone podcast at this point. So without further ado, I think we'll get started. And we should start with the question that we didn't answer during our last AMA episode. This is coming from Mo, CEO of Benji and founder of Women in Color, who had asked us, how much value does Collision Conference create for the Canadian tech ecosystem, if any? Now, some of you may have seen BetaKit's opening evening coverage of the opening night of Collision. Some more of you, based upon conversations I've had in the past week, definitely saw my live tweets of the opening event. We'll talk about that a little bit, but let's get to the broad, holistic considerations. And I'm just a mere media member. I've been spending most of my time either on a patio with a drink or in the media village, where they don't have any drinks other than coffee, but oat milk. Rob, you have been out and about as an entrepreneur, the 40-year-old founder. What is your perspective on this? Oftentimes we throw to you for your experience in business, running them. But now this is a conference that's more for you than it is for BetaKit in a certain sense. So how do you see, maybe even just tech conferences in general, and we can crank down to Collision?
And we also got a corollary of a question from an investor, actually, who was like, what's the value to the Canadian, Ontario, Toronto ecosystem and sort of the startups themselves? So there's coming at it from a bunch of different perspectives. I guess it's like, what's the economic value versus what's the value for a startup or an investor or whatever.
Interestingly, for an event with 35,000 people, we have both founders and VCs sending us questions asking why they're there.
I mean, it's a really generally good question. I mean, I think that obviously the last episode we chatted with Patty, so have a listen and hear what he has to say about his perspective on the matter. I think these conferences there's a ton of them. Some of them I think they have different intentions behind them. Some of them try to be more exclusive. Some of them try to, Collision by its name is trying to, I think it's like engineered serendipity or something to that effect. Mm-hmm. Whereas different kinds
human
of
connections was the key metric that Patty talked about on last week's episode.
Yeah. Hard to measure, and then hard to then extrapolate both in terms of how do you measure the value that's created? Because it's like you do pitch to VCs if you're an entrepreneur or something like that, but it's not clear that a check is written the day after or the moment after you pitch them. But sometimes you need to build these relationships over time. If you're an entrepreneur or an investor, you don't want to just write these checks. So I think generally these events are, I think if you want to be super nerdy about them, what you do is you plan out who you want to talk to, target those people. No matter what your role is in the conference, you figure out who you want to talk to and then talk to those people. Mm-hmm. It did feel a little interesting because on the one hand, Collision specifically, I found that it was, I've said this a bunch of times, but it's super nice to see human beings you've only seen in 2 dimensions, either ever or for many years.
Jokes aside, that has been very energizing throughout the week.
Absolutely. It's just nice to see people And so you felt that energy, I think, in the conference, being there, whether they're like during the day events or the night events or whatever. That was really, really great. Although it felt a little like the time we're recording this in June of 2022. And I know this will come up in a later question, but juxtaposing the energy of the event with what's happening in the real world, there felt like there was a bit of an incongruity around like, hey, startups all the time. This is great. It's celebrating the tech culture and startup culture. And look, there's even incumbents there. There was people like a lot of the booths there that you have to pay for. All conferences are like this. Collision is no exception. There's like incumbents. There's people selling services. So they're not just entrepreneurs and VCs. There's people who are selling into the ecosystem. And those booths aren't cheap. And the economy is the economy. So I'd say like, all in all, it was super energizing. You said, how did you see it? Are you seeing it from a media perspective? You get to see all the things. Are you feeling like this is just another conference that you've covered, like you covered one in 2019, or did this feel materially different to you from a like creating value in the ecosystem? To most question.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's what we look to get from it as a media organization, and then there's what comes from it because we're a media organization that covers Canadian tech, right? But I'll say just even off the top that I think beyond just the seeing people in person energy, I think some of the partial vibe here is one of, I remember very distinctly at SaaS North in November of 2021, which was kind of the first event back in Canadian tech in that window where everyone had just been double vaxxed. Omicron had not hit, and it seemed like everyone's double vaxxed and this thing isn't gone yet, but we can mediate this. So there was a cautiousness there, and then an energy of, oh, hey, things are back. That was, I think, driven by a sense that double vax life left you invincible, and people were going to be doing things again. Obviously, things have changed, but I would say in June of 2022. I was struck by energy of, one, having internationals come bringing their perspective on COVID to Canada, and then just being like, I guess we have to adopt this now because they're here and there's a lot of people around, right? The COVID doesn't exist. Shout out to the Sky News guy in the media room all week who's just been coughing incessantly and looks very unwell, but continues to do his job surrounded by us all. But then also I think whether it's the economy or even just the sense of like, okay, so we're going to go back to doing things the way they were before. Is that worth it? Which is really weird for 35,000 people to show up to make that evaluation. Now, that being said, let's talk this through. Patty on our podcast noted that they were looking to double down this year on having more intricate, detailed, significant conversations. He had noted they've been chasing kind of star power in previous years, and they were looking to kind of go back to that. And he anticipated more people attending the content because in times of trouble, we look to understand what's going on. I don't think that has been the case. I believe he has admitted in press conferences since that like a lot more people are just doing the social thing and not attending the content. And if you saw our coverage of the opening night content, it seems like they hadn't really figured out the balance between that kind of hard-hitting, serious conversation component. There is legitimate value in social connections here. I'll say that as a media member. There are companies that we get to talk to because they're here far more easily than we would at any other time. And certainly we can call them up. We do interviews remotely all the time at any points in time over the phone or Zoom or whatever. And in the last 2 years, much of our coverage has been done remotely. But it's a different scenario when you have the CEO of 1Password, Apply Board, and the CTO of Fair back to back to back in interviews. That's just fundamentally different for a publication in terms of like consistency of content because of the connections here. I'll also say there have been a number of conversations that will inform future BetaKit content that would not happen without these social dynamics. So the social connectivity is strong for us as a media member. And I think it's also strong for companies looking to sell or connect and do all that. To the question of the conference itself, like what it's bringing on behalf of Canadian tech, I think is kind of like, we have to just get the fuck over this question, to be honest, because as Patty said last week on the podcast, like we're bringing North America's tech leaders to your ecosystem. We don't have to do anything more than that. If you can't get value from that, it's cool. We'll use your city as a great location to host a tech event, which I think is like pretty fair. Now, to that value, I think it's indicated by having access to these people. I don't think it's through the content. I honestly think it's through creating the space for people to connect. To the additional VC question we got about whether it builds value for the ecosystem, I think I would note, and this is something that you and I have not run into each other at an event. We've only seen each other at the conference, which is crazy. But one of the interesting things I've noted from the Canadian tech ecosystem, which is not one ecosystem, it's a variety of city-states that have attended this conference separately, is that they are using it as an opportunity to connect with each other separate from each ecosystem. Last night being a great example. The Calgary tech ecosystem all got on a boat on Lake Ontario and hung out, because when you can get to the Great Lakes, you get on a boat and hang out. Shout out TWG, who I think copyrighted that idea a few years ago. The Vancouver tech ecosystem took over the distillery district of Toronto and all hung out with themselves. And the Toronto tech ecosystem was on Ossington, as we might normally be, all hanging out with each other. And there's some minor overlap, but it seems interesting to me that the Canadian founders and Canadian VCs asking us what the value is are also the people who are just sticking in their pockets of connecting with the same people.
In fact, to the broader corollary, but like, if you've ever gone to Web Summit, which is the same folks put on that conference in Portugal, what I find with Canadians is if you're a Canadian entrepreneur and you're like, why would I go to Web Summit? Because I don't need Portuguese or Italian customers or whatever. It's a fantastic way to meet other Canadian investors and entrepreneurs because they don't want to talk to anyone else other than each other. It's a fantastic way to get time with people you'd never actually spend time with. And I mean, I still think like it saddens me, and I understand that it is to the benefit of the business model of Collision to have these sort of regionals. Like if you've gone to the conference or you haven't gone to the conference, what you see is there are companies like AWS and Loom and some Canadian startups like Applyboard. They buy these booth spaces to show off their product, and hopefully people will sign up. But there's a whole heck of a lot of, weirdly, a lot of countries, like Italy was there, Hungary was there, Ukraine was there, saying, hey, we've got a tech ecosystem. And then equally,
Luxembourg,
I think more strange, Luxembourg, yeah, that's, the big tech ecosystem of Luxembourg. Then there's like, this happens every year now. I find it so strange. It's like the sub-York region below Durham, but above Oshawa area. And I'm like...
Brampton was representing at Collision this week.
Yes, they had Batman.
And maybe I'll include this in the post. A very interesting map of what the Ontario Innovation Corridor looks like and where they might be positioned in it. But you know what? Always be branding, Brampton. You're doing great work. And all those people from outside of the GTA coming to Toronto for this conference learned a lot about Brampton.
Yes. That's where Batman parks his car. So I think like what I find strange about it is that if we're presenting ourselves to the world, I don't think anybody who's not from Ontario or Canada, or Ontario specifically, because it's an Ontario physical event. So that's subdivided on Ontario, where Calgary shows up as Calgary. It's like, here's the subdivisions of Ontario. No one cares. What they care about is, are there interesting companies doing interesting things? Where they're located kind of doesn't really matter. And we're a relatively small country. And so the subdivision by region seems a little bit unnecessary, especially the subdivisions seem a little crazy. And so I think we could do a better job as a ecosystem presenting ourselves. Maybe let's slice it by vertical. Let's slice it by technology.
No, we're all rival city-states vying for attention.
Yes, to your point about the parties.
The parties and the general attitudes and the delegations or the booth space.
And I get it. Everyone wants to be like, look, we're a thing. But there may be a more effective way to do that as a country, especially because, look, I talked to a bunch of VCs who are like, hey, I get, to your point, Douglas, I get as a VC, I talk to companies I would never normally spend any time with, but they're here and I can walk by them and I can have a chat with them. And even just there's a bunch of VCs who invest in this ecosystem from not Canada who want to meet Canadian companies and want to meet other Canadian investors to see where they can partner up. And that's the value you don't necessarily see on the ticket. But that's the thing that we need to be, as an ecosystem, pushing, which is like, no. There's great talent, there's great capital, and there's great opportunity here. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Just find the thing that matches your interest or your thesis. And that is there, but not through lack of trying.
And let's be honest here. This is the most exposure that Canadian tech companies ever get, because Collision feels some obligation to have a Canadian presence there. For as much as Patty wants to talk about the willingness of Canadian companies to be asked the tough questions on stage, he was specifically interested in whether or not Shopify would participate. There has been no greater exposure. There's been no greater spotlight on Indigenous tech in Canada than is what has taken place at Collision. When you see writers from Forbes and Fortune being exposed to Indigenous tech companies and wondering why there isn't more of that in the United States, like, that is truly impactful, right? So I think we have walked the line here between constructively criticizing maybe some of the elements to a tech event that just seem like they're there still because that's what happens every year, and the true value of like connecting with people. As silly as it sounds, the human connections component of what Patty spoke to is truly meaningful. Mm-hmm. Okay, Rob, you're up. Next question.
I think as a corollary, Tony Dagger from RBCX.
Oh, Tony Dagger.
Was curious to know, since we're talking about the conference itself, what is the mood at Collision as it relates to tech layoffs? And is the industry talking about it, or is it ignoring it? Did you get a sense of that pattern, independent of just reporting on stuff that was going on in the ecosystem, not at the conference?
Yeah, that's what's interesting, because Anthony from RBCX, who was actually on the panel I moderated today at Collision about using Canada as a launch pad to North America to international delegates, is usually the kind of guy that I would ask that question to. So cover it from
revenge.
At different angles. So in our coverage on BetaKit, we are talking, every company we're talking to and writing about, we're talking to them about whether they're laying anybody off, whether they're freezing hiring, generally where they are in managing their burn and capital. So it's an always on conversation in our coverage. Fundamentally, it's certainly a part of the content at Collision where you see a huge swath of crypto companies just didn't show up. Now, some of that is because they're being raided by the FBI, possibly as we speak. But last year at SaaS North, the CEO of Hootsuite backed out of being on stage at Hootsuite shortly after BetaKit and the Globe and Mail reported that they were planning to IPO before the end of the year. This is different than that. So I think that component was top of mind everywhere in conversations, particularly with every VC, for a couple of reasons. One, they have portfolios of companies who are all trying to figure this stuff out. So there's some note sharing and best practices there. But there are conversations in the market right now, as informed by the conversations we had recently about VCCI and changes there, and just like macroeconomic pressures, very Tony Dagger type stuff. See both past podcasts about how that is impacting the fund-to-fund ecosystem, how that's impacting LPs, and the pressure that is having on Canadian VCs. And I think that is the real mood killer, because for people who were through 2008, this doesn't feel like that, but it seems like it doesn't feel like that yet. And there are a few dominoes slightly further down the horizon that, as you go upstream of capital from startups, are starting to look a little weird. So I would say for certain companies who aren't looking to raise within the next year and a half, like take Applyboard, you'll see that on BetaKit by the time this podcast go live. They're feeling pretty okay. But the macro component of VC firms looking to do capital calls to invest in companies, startups looking to raise rounds right now, or you get debt, it is a true mood. The vibe is strong.
That's interesting because I found that it did feel to me as like just walking the show floor, talking to VCs, talking to startups. And the way Collision does it is there's like alpha, which is like super early stage companies, maybe don't even have any money raised yet, maybe have some a bit of traction. There's beta, and I think there's growth, I think is the, and so they've categorized the companies that way. And it's funny because it did feel, and I'm not sure if this is just a proxy from like everyone just being happy to be somewhere and see human beings, how much of that rubbed off on it. It felt sort of like, hey, there's cool stuff happening and there's great things to see. And I want to go to this booth and I want to see this startup and I want to see this talk. I felt like it felt a bit insulated from sort of the reality. There were some talks from people saying, you know, this is what a down time looks like. It didn't feel like anything was new there. It just felt like this is the narrative now. The narrative is that things are going to stink. So I'm just going to do some talks on things that are going to stink. And if you're talking to like VCs, sort of, I don't want to say off the record, but just sort of the pattern that I tended to see was they're like, oh, we can finally not have to bid on stuff without doing any thinking just because the numbers are fleeting. And maybe this means we can actually, if we do deploy capital, we can do it at a bit more of a reasonable cost. Although the assessment that I've heard a few times was like with Canadian companies, that's not quite the same as it was. You know what I mean? Like it's not as much of an issue as it was.
Yeah. It's not a dark or necessarily sour mood, but it's a mood of assessment. And it's a mood of trying to read tea leaves and signals. And the further you go upstream from companies, the more furrowed the brow is, I think. But
totally.
Even, you know, like to be very blunt, an hour into the start of Collision on Monday night, Bay broke a story about Toronto-based company Bonsai having laid off through this second round of layoffs, now 2/3 of its staff over the last 2 months. And that's after raising $21 million last year. 2/3 of their staff. So like when that is a story that can come out within the first hour of Collision existing, there's an obvious overhang there. Even removing the international component of like US crypto or the crypto market generally and predominantly US companies like flailing from that, right?
But did you get a sense that to Tony's question, like that was overhanging the conference, but there were still Web3 companies pitching their ideas. There was still investor meet. Like if you didn't know any better, you'd
1,000x return built into the technology. That's the,
you know, so I don't know. I just didn't feel like the mood at Collision didn't, for me at least, reflect like it almost seemed like, again, it could have been a function of the fact that people are like, oh my God, I'm seeing human beings and I can see people I haven't seen in years or meet really interesting new people. Which
you can say, Rob, it was only talked about after the third drink. It wasn't the first or second drink conversation.
First was COVID, second was weather. Then
it was the aside when things got quiet for a minute. So what's going on? And I don't think it's being ignored, but I do think it was being explored, if not addressed. You know what? More and more tech leaders, some of them absolute giants, have been making the same discovery. And it's Linebox Studio, the architectural firm that has become the dominant force in designing offices and headquarters for serious IT firms. We're talking about Shopify, Element AI, Clipfolio, BenchSci, Gsoft, and now Hootsuite have learned that a great team and groundbreaking work gets inspiration from what surrounds them. Linebox has designed winning environments for all of these companies. Are you their next success story? Well, find out at linebox.ca. Okay, as you might know, we're a person down for this AMA episode. Normally we have Katie, our podcast producer, kind of hosting the thing with us and just hanging out, but we didn't contract her to do any interviews during Collision. So she's living her life, but she did have time to submit a question, and it's a typically Katie question. And I'm choosing it in our list here, going back and forth, so Rob can answer first. So this is a question from Katie, our podcast producer. What trends are you guys seeing from clean tech perspective at the conference? Anything making you feel less darkest timeline about the state of our world? AKA, is tech going to save us soon? Oh, Katie.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely met a bunch of startups in this space at the conference itself. Really interesting ideas. Like some of them were not even, some were from like, I met a woman from Alberta who was doing some crazy stuff with like extracting lithium using really smart osmosis. I didn't even understand what it was. So there is innovation happening there.
That's basically alchemy. You basically just described alchemy.
Yes. And then gold. I didn't see too much. Maybe I was going down the wrong hallways, but it's super easy to spin up a software company. And so when you've got rows and rows of companies, what you see are software companies looking for customers and trying to find ways to market, and a whole bunch of, it's different, but there's a ton of Web3 related conversations and stuff. So I didn't see too much in the way of clean tech. Douglas, did you?
I did. So full disclosure, this is like a little inside baseball, but like at these conferences during the day, unless you're assigned out, journalists aren't just like seeing content, right? And the members of the Beta Kit team that have been doing it all week, doing it very well, Megan Simpson, our associate editor, and Josh Scott, our resident tall mustache guy, have been doing a great job filing specific stories on what's going on with the state of deal values or one-on-one interviews with, as I said before, CEOs of 1Password. You'll see a Alberta Tech profile up by the time this is live, CTO of Fair, Apply Board, all those things. So they're checking out general sessions. One thing to also note, the way that Collision is set up, you kind of just got to like squeeze yourself in and find a seat. You might not be able to get the sessions you want to go to. But I do want to highlight something from the opening night conversation, because they were, again, trying to address big ideas. And they had Youngwoo, CEO of Mars, and Margaret Atwood somehow on stage to talk, for 5 seconds about Roe v. Wade. And then for the most of it, to identify clean tech. Now, if you're a regular Beta Kit reader, you'd know that Mars has just launched a new clean tech accelerator with KPMG Canada, and they have a recently released climate impact report. I recommend you check it out. But there was one thing in that conversation, Youngwoo kind of noted that truly resonated with me, is the need to be, well, let me just read the quote. If you're in the business of creating something from nothing, you better be an optimist. This is a time for small groups of committed people to do special things. Now, does that sound like something Mars's comm team wrote for Youngwoo? Yes, it does. Does it still resonate? Yes, it does. And there was something that he noted from the clean tech report that Mars had pulled together with some of the companies in their portfolio, which I think is truly a hopeful data point. Following the list of Canadian clean tech companies currently working on these innovations, the real hurdle is market penetration. It's not we don't have technologies that can make an impact. They've got to be distributed. And he had noted that 1% of market penetration of these clean tech companies would take out half of Canada's emissions, which is significant, understandable, conceivable, and like from a certain perspective, capitalist driven. So I don't know if there was anything, it wasn't necessarily a technology. It was a framing of the need and the value of embracing this in a way that I think doesn't feel like clicking your heels 3 times and saying there's no place like home. What about you, Rob? You have been more out and about than me, right? Like you did leave the media area, right?
It's so interesting. It's that like the juxtaposition of what you're finding, what people are telling you, what like Collision is like, or the stages and the messaging that's being sent out there. And then I'm like walking the floor all day, which is just like, unscientific. What are the booths? What are the companies? What are they doing? What are they trying to sell? Like, and it doesn't reflect. I'm not saying there were no clean tech companies there. I'm saying if you're squinting your eyes and kind of looking at like, what am I seeing where the focus of effort is being put? It didn't seem to be there. Now, that doesn't mean just because you don't buy a booth doesn't mean you're working on something, And so it's up to those companies to decide, especially when you're doing clean tech stuff, the payoffs, it takes a long time. You don't just spin up a software company about like cats.
It's not like you're giving out pens as like a funnel thing at conferences mostly. Like you're
right, because you're like, here, buy my solar panels for your farm. Like that's just not something that, or invest in my solar. It takes a long time to develop, a longer time to develop those technologies than say a software company. And I don't know if that means that they're just like, it's not worth it, or they're having a lot of those meetings. Again, I think a lot of the value that's captured is not easy to capture. It's hard to say. I mean, usually tourist events are like, this much money is spent in restaurants on or about, on food trucks on or about the venue. It's hard to capture the more subtle things where you're meeting people, you're getting seed rounds, but you don't have a booth, but you're working on clean tech.
Yeah, I think so. That's maybe one component of a Collision, and I would say Web Summit that should be noted here is their willingness to have government participate. A little bit as content. We had Minister Champagne and Mayor John Tory on stage throughout the week. Amber Mack was involved. Enough said. But because delegations come through, because, Invest in Canada has floor space, you actually have policy influencers and like executive leaders with a capacity to connect. So I think one of the things that kind of comes from this is like, if Mayor Tory wants to solve some issues by connecting with companies to adopt that technology in the city of Toronto, he can book those because he's here throughout the week. And I think that's, again, it's not a show floor thing. It's the meet in person, get the delegates together and talk some things through scenario, which I'm sure most of our listeners get very excited by. But okay, let's do one more. Close us off here.
All right, Douglas, last question. So Roger Bahari Lal of IDC was wondering, there's a lot of hype and excitement this week, but did you see any underappreciated technology or company or region or trend that doesn't usually get media airtime but caught your eye?
Shout out to Brampton. You're doing the work. Honestly, just let's respect a well-conceived and executed strategy. Having a Batmobile and Batman on the floor with major like banner promotion is incredible. But again, I'll share the link to the graphic of Brampton's place in the innovation corridor. And there are a lot of people walking through the halls of Collision this week being like, okay, smack dab in the middle. I will believe that. So shout outs Brampton. And then actually one thing this came, was connecting with a company I can't name, but this again, one of the interesting components of Collision is that because there's so many evening events going on, they do try to like theme them out. And I ended up this evening at an event filled with like companies working in the AI space or using AI in some interesting way. And I ended up speaking to a bio pharma company who is working on developing a novel alternative to pain reduction. And it was something BetaKit might never cover. It might never come to pass. For anyone who's listened to any of our health tech coverage, it's really hard. And it's got to be approved in the US first before it'll come here. But I would say just that process of talking to really smart people about the science behind offering an alternative to anti-inflammatories or opioids was awesome. And then extending that conversation over adult beverages about what's the process of going to market? How does that impact the insurance space and all those things, like the need to get FDA approval, not only because it's quicker and easier and faster and less complicated than doing in Canada, but the whole world will kind of accept FDA approval. So do it there first. It was really cool because there's a lot of companies that are selling you a better widget or the web with another version on it where suddenly you become a content farmer for greater value or like whatever Dapper Labs CEO was saying on stage. I'm just going to say it. Shout outs William Johnson. But just talking to a doctor, like a Canadian-based company with connections with US doctors, just about them trying to like eliminate pain was pretty cool. So let's hear it for new drugs.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, I think, I'm not going to go down the technology space, but I think like I'm going to sort of counterpoint to the point that I made before about the like subdividing the country into smaller and smaller parcels. I think the pattern that seems to be the case, it felt a little more like we had sort of pan-Canadian representation here. If you could blur your eyes and get rid of the logos of where the companies were from, you're like, oh, you know what? There's a good showing from across Canada. They're not, obviously, based on population, they're overrepresented based on the regions they come from, but it really felt like this wasn't a Toronto conference with a few other companies from other regions. It really felt like, no, the companies are good companies. Oh, what that you're in Calgary? Oh, what's that you're in Vancouver? Oh, what's that you're in Halifax? Didn't matter. Even Yukon.
Yukon Tech. Love Yukon Tech.
It's great. It was so cool. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that to me, the feeling is that the pie was maybe overrepresenting the province that the conference was in 2019. And it feels a little more like, okay, we're getting a good cross-section of the Canadian tech ecosystem and you're not missing out on anything. So
are you saying that Canadian tech is underappreciated? Is that our thrilling conclusion?
No, I just think, I just think that it is more evenly distributed and now we can actually see it. And it's not like, it's not necessarily geographically centered only. You can actually see amazing technologies and you can see great regions to do stuff. So the way I took your point, maybe this is not what you meant, but it's like, we just are down on ourselves in Canada where I'm like, no, I see the fruits of investment in innovation across the country actually starting to bear fruit and us, yes, appreciating it at the same time. But one doesn't mean the other. It's just because you can underappreciate something, but that doesn't mean anything's actually happening, or you can appreciate something, but doesn't mean anything's happening. But it really feels like we're slowly moving the dial in terms of, hey, maybe we can be an innovation ecosystem. Let's see whether the iteration 2 or iteration 3 of reinvestment in our economy by people who are focusing on this area can actually make a difference. And it seems to be bearing fruit despite the end of days.
So the brand is strong. And think of next year if Shopify actually shows up. One extra one that I'll just say, I really think these Web3 guys, the crypto companies, you know what? Just keep building. One day you'll get your due. I think don't let the haters get you down. The Beta Kid podcast is produced by Beta Kid Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.